I thank Vera yesterday who asked me to introduce myself. Of course, that took 5 minutes, and now I have 5 minutes more. The context, that was the personal context. The intellectual context is that roughly 4 years ago, I sort of came back to philosophy, and it was by means of social networks and blogs, and I became aware of the history of philosophy since I left it. I had a 10-year gap decade, and then I saw speculative realism and object-oriented ontology, a history of the 20th century, so it was a little more than the 10 years that I missed out on. And it talked about an opposition between a form of creepy-crawly relativism that came from the postmoderns and the post-structuralists, and the biosu called correlationism on one side, and a new philosophy which was called realism in some form or other, and it has several variants. There's the sort of naturalist or scientistic realism of Ray Brassier and Levi Bryant, the supernatural realism of Graham Harman, and the mathematical realism of Maya Su. And I had a quote, but I won't be able to find it, where Zizek says, we are in an epoch of the struggle for intellectual hegemony. There is on one side the post-structuralist relativism, and the other side the cognitivist scientism. And his solution was return to Lacan. The people I like, I sort of was a little critical of them yesterday. The pluralists, Hubert Dreyfus, Sean Kelly, Bernard Stiegler, Bruno Latour, Deleuze, and Lyotard, and one of my first loves in philosophy, FEYERABEND'S. And they don't see that struggle as a struggle at all. They see those two sides as premised on a set of shared assumptions, and their idea of what the struggle was, if there's to be a struggle, is between a form of monism, and they consider relativism to have a monist basis, and on the other side a form of pluralism. So that's the context. Now my introduction. In an interview about his new book, Eyes, Michel Serres declares, "The night is the model for our knowledge, not the day. We enter a classroom, we enter a museum, like entering a cavern. The cavern is the place of knowledge. Plato was wrong. To see truth as a sun is a rather fascist idea. There's not just one truth, but billions of truths like so many stars." This rejoins a quote from the beginning of Felicity's talk from Richard Nixon, who says something very similar about the thousands of suns. So where are we when we think computationally? According to Serres, we're in the cavern, but in a revision form of the cavern. So the new image of truth evoked by Michel Serres in his advice to find truth inside the cavern does not correspond to a single and unique experience, a once and for all metaphysical conversion. Suddenly we become pluralists, where before we were in the darkness of monism. But it's a methodological and heuristic rule of thumb that can work some of the time and be irrelevant at other times, and it's something that we apply over and over again. So what I want to show with FEYERABEND is that quite regularly he decides that the philosophy that he has is in fact in the sun, and and so an abstraction, and so he goes to an even deeper cavern to re-vision the cavern otherwise. So in very many situations, we are in a dark cavern, immobilized and gazing at illusions. We may want to find outside the situation some hard and fast reality, a solar truth, to guide us out of this spectacle. And sometimes it works. Sometimes we find a hard and fast reality or a truth. More often, we must overcome our limitations while remaining within the cavern, free our gaze from its fixity, liberate our body from its chains, move around in the cavern and see it from different points of view, exchange ideas and experiences with others that we meet. The cavern is also the isolated ego, surrounded, as Carl Jung described it, by a multitude of little luminosities or scintillae or sparks. This inversion of the sun into the cavern amounts to a revisioning of the cavern. It's no longer the place of untruth, but a site of multiple truths. Not so much an anti-cavern as a non-cavern. So this is my tribute to Francois Laruelle and his idea of non-philosophy and later non-standard philosophy. We know that the prefix non does not convey the negation, rather the extension, the generalization, and the pluralization of the root noun on the model of non-Euclidean geometry. But while true, this knowledge about the non is merely a preliminary superficial apprehension. The prefix non does not just add more of the same old familiar stuff. It involves the radical inversion, the defamiliarization, the estrangement of the domain it operates on. Johan has talked about estrangement a little this morning, and he did it. The non-cavern is not the negation of the cavern, but the suspension of its limitations, their inversion into newness, openness, and manyness. It is seen to be an ambiguous object, which includes its own outside as part of its very constitution. The non-cavern is erewhon, here and now, under suspension and already estranged. It is thus both mystical and empirical at once. But what is suspended is the authority and uniqueness of the philosophical sun. This sun is a principle of sufficiency, and so in fact a principle of indigence and exclusion because of the bifurcations and the demarcations that it involves. Michel Serres calls on us to suspend this indigence in favour of a non-principle, one of abundance, affirming the primacy of multiplicity over sufficient unity. Suspending the sufficiency of the sun is by no means the abandoning of concepts and arguments and meaning and speech and definitions. It is merely the suspension of the philosophical illusion of the bifurcation between the sun and the cavern. Not abandonment of philosophy, but its estrangement into abundance. Deeper than any opposition, Michel Serres implicitly invokes an agon, or struggle, of the cavern with this other pluralist version of itself, which includes both light and shadow. Going outdoors into the light, leaving the cavern for its other, is the futile Platonic gesture of leaving the cavern for a supposed transcendence. That's, in fact, leaving it for a larger cavern or a cavern next door, or thinking you're leaving the cavern and going around full circle into the cavern again. That's the illusion of the outsideness of the sun. Better to admit that the outside is immanent in agony rather than peaceful coexistence with the inside. A similar image to that of the sun in the cavern, or for me it's similar, can be found in stories from Paolino's tapes, a series of recorded letters the FEYERABEND'S sent to his partner, Grazia Borini, when he was separated from her by his teaching positions in different countries. The first track of this document begins with a citation in German from Brecht's Three-Penny Opera. So for the first uni time, I will say something in German, and then I'll translate it. FEYERABEND sang it, but I won't sing it. Denn die einen stehen im Dunkeln und die anderen stehen im Licht. Und man sieht nur die im Lichter, die im Dunkeln sieht man nicht. FEYERABEND translate this, and the ones stand in darkness and the others stand in the light. We only see those who stand in the light. those who stand in darkness we don't see. So FEYERABEND describes a scene from the play, from Brecht's play, where you see a few people in the light jumping around and a huge number of people in the darkness being born, dying, laughing, crying, joining together. This, according to FEYERABEND, is humanity. Not just the elect in the light, but all the others who go unsung and unnoticed in their diversity. He remarks that when intellectuals talk about humanity, they mean more people like themselves, other intellectuals in the first world. This image contains in a nutshell FEYERABEND's whole philosophy, which can be viewed as an attempt to find the multiple luminosities in all things and all people, and to relativize the projected light of the ego and of privileged groups. This brings out the political implications of Sayre's inversion of Plato. What FEYERABEND advocates means, as with Sayre, siding politically with the canon. So I had my documents are all mixed up. So to talk about the part that I cut out, and then I'll cut out something that I cut in. FEYERABEND is often known as an epistemological anarchist because of his slogan, anything goes, which was first set forward in a book, no, the book came after, in an essay called Against Method in 1972, and which was expanded, but he cut some really important things out, was expanded into a book published in 1976, and people react to the slogan, anything goes, which in fact is a cosmological slogan. It should read, anything goes, insofar as the cosmos permits it to go, and no further. People retain the truncated version, anything goes, and they truncate the story of the evolution of FEYERABEND's thought, and forget the beginning and don't know very much about the later parts. I divided the evolution into 6 stages. In the 50s, FEYERABEND had what amounts to a form of process philosophy. He based it on Ernst Mach, and he took from Ernst Mach just the idea that what exists, this is the ontology. I could call it a meta-ontology, but when I first published it, I protected myself, I called it a flexi-ontology. And it's just a statement that what exists is elements and relations. And then what the elements are will depend on your context, on your regional application. It will generate a regional ontology, what the relations between them are. You can imagine a case where the elements and the relations are not distinct. The elements are absorbed in the relations. FEYERABEND sometimes explained it in terms of Ernst Mach. He also explained it in terms of Hegel, but he used Mach and John Stuart Mill to pluralize Hegel, so it's a Hegel where there's no necessary rule of synthesis. There's no necessary rule. It's a particular case of the negation as a negation. Sometimes it might apply to the movement of the elements, which can be things in the world or ideas. And he also explained it in terms of Niels Bohr's version of the quantum theory. That's his philosophy from the 50s. Around a little later, maybe, he combined that with Karl Popper's idea of falsificationism, bold conjectures and strong refutations. And together he produced what later he guiltily declared was a philosophy. He had a philosophy in the 60s, and it was expressed in an essay called On the Improvement of the Arts and Sciences and the Possible Identity of the Two. It was a universal methodology, and so, according to him, cosmology, that applied to all domains equally, and it gave obligatory prescriptions that one must try to criticize experience and replace experience with a better experience, that one should try to multiply alternatives and not just have one single point of view. So I want to describe how from there, that general philosophy, which was a pluralist methodology, he moved to what could be called his anarchism, which is the third stage. And he recounts an anecdote. It occurred in 1965 in Hamburg with von Weizsäcker's seminar on quantum theory. Feyerabend was totally into his methodological pluralism, and he discussed with Weizsäcker the fact that alternative interpretations of the data had not been considered. According to Feyerabend, my arguments were excellent, but von Weizsäcker gave a historical account of the rise of quantum theory, and this was very much richer and more rewarding, and I realized that what I was talking about was just a dream. This is a continual theme with Feyerabend. He realizes that what he thought was his philosophical sun was just a dream, and he went through conversion experiences, although because for Feyerabend, at least later on, but all his phases are together in various proportions at the same time. You don't really need a full-blown conversion experience because there are always elements of the other positions, at least in the margins of your framework. So in these conversations, von Weizsäcker didn't abandon rational argument. He merely refused to accept Feyerabend's abstract arguments and treated them as irrelevant to the historical process, so he mentioned it, an adjustment that characterized the development of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory. He argued historically and not abstractly, allowing the methods to emerge in the imminent field of research. Feyerabend remarks that he realized that this was in fact the point of view of Ernst Mach, yet again. The Mach always argued historically, and so he found that his conversion was in fact a return to Mach. The fourth phase came after a second conversion, a couple of years later, I think, when there were changes in the educational policy in the universities in the United States, and lots of people who before were excluded from the educational system were admitted. So there were lots of indigenous people, veterans, working class people, and Feyerabend saw them and thought, who am I to inculcate, to indoctrinate them with my philosophy? So even if it's a very nice and open and fluid and tolerant and anarchistic philosophy, it's still something that belongs to one intellectual and is perhaps not adapted to the conditions of life or the ideals of these people. So there he moved to what he called his democratic relativism, and the idea is that in fact he used his old arguments but gave them a different interpretation under the cover of a different attitude. He says, today the same arguments are offered with a very different purpose in mind, and they lead to a very different result. All attempts to revive traditions that were put aside and eliminated in the course of the expansion of Western culture run into an impenetrable stone wall of rationalistic phrases and prejudices. I try to show that there are no arguments to support this wall, and that some principles implicit in science definitely favour its removal. One of the things I've taken out of the essay is all the parallels with Deleuze and Latour, but this notion of the running up against the wall and trying to get through the wall or bouncing off the wall and trying to remove the wall is something that he shares in common with Deleuze, and the wall is, at least on one interpretation, a rationalist barrier. For Feyerabend, this democratic pluralism permits us to protect people and traditions from attempts at political control, proceeding by the imposition of traditions of thought and practice that are validated by a worldview that is presented as reality itself. He affirms the determination of what is real cannot be the prerogative of an abstract ontology, and thus of the intellectuals who promulgate it. There is no one fixed framework. The manifest realities, he's beginning to talk in terms of different projected realities or manifest realities. These are multiple, and being itself is unknowable, according to him. It's unknowable, but I'll qualify that later. Thus, the determination of what is real depends on our choice in favour of one form of life or another, on a political decision. This leads to Feyerabend's conclusion: ontology without politics is incomplete and arbitrary. Feyerabend's democratic pluralism is based on dialogue, open exchange, and democratic self-correcting and self-transforming processes. So it's a collective subjectivity. The individual for him is a tradition that is englobed in other traditions, such as a group which is englobed in a society, and they're all self-correcting traditions that can interact with each other. I'll just go very quickly on to prepare the fifth phase, which was an ontological pluralism. Feyerabend wanted to get away from the idea that he was being tolerant of other traditions, but we had the scientific presupposition that they are to be tolerated, but their ontology is just wrong. We know enough about the universe to know that rainmaking doesn't work, or that acupuncture doesn't work, and so on. This is his cosmological phase, but he had already begun talking about that in the last part of Against Method. Usually we remember the history of the arguments against particular rules of scientific method, and the historical analysis of Galileo's contributions to the scientific revolution. It's a pity because that's the one place he talks about the sun, because Galileo, by going from a geocentric to a heliocentric cosmology, inverts the sun in one way. And there we have a list of processes. People think that Feyerabend has no method, but he gives a whole set of methods that Galileo used. Inverting the sun is, whichever way you invert it, is a pretty complex process and requires often erasing whole domains of experience and replacing it with a totally constructed experience. It involves bringing in new technology when we're not really sure of how the technology works and of its applicability. It involves revising cosmological assumptions very explicitly, or using rhetorical power to distract people from the fact that you're revising the cosmology. So that would be a case of the processes behind inversing the sun. Strangely enough, Feyerabend thinks that Galileo was in fact applying a revised version of a Homeric cosmology. So in the last third of the book, he talks about the Homeric cosmology, which he thinks is a version of what, a concrete version of what Ernst Mach elaborated later. So the basic idea is that in the Homeric cosmology, there's no essences, we're all assemblages, everything is plural, there's no single word for the body is an assemblage of parts, that we are relay stations for different forces called the gods, that traverse us. So that is one model that he finds in Galileo, not in Galileo's explicit ideas about the cosmos, but in Galileo's method of conducting science. He finds it later in Ernst Mach. He finds it in a different form in the rivals, well, one of the rivals at least, to quantum theory. He finds it again in David Bohm. And so it's a model for what he wants to propose in his cosmological phase, not just by itself, but he wants to combine it with the biblical model. This he doesn't talk much about in Against Method. The biblical model is, or the biblical cosmology is one that is based on a reality that is, or a being that is hidden, that expresses itself in hints, in enigmatic pronouncements and events that we have to interpret and that we can always interpret wrongly. And so we're always looking for the response of being. These two he considers to be non-rationalist, with the capital R rationalist, cosmologies, and he describes the progressive introduction of rationalist cosmology. He calls it, like a lot of people, Platonic, but he has specific chapters in his later, or articles in his later works on Xenophanes, and then Parmenides, and then Plato. So Homeric cosmology he calls sometimes cosmology A. He describes the rise of the abstract traditions, cosmology B, and what he would like is a return to a mixture of cosmology A and what cosmology said, the biblical cosmology. And often he just goes between sort of come and go in a synthesis of these two cosmologies, but expressed at an abstract level. And I just want to talk about one article where he goes a little further. So my title for this part is Meaning is Cosmological, Pauli, Jung and Symbols. The text is Quantum Theory and Our View of the World. It's in the book, the posthumous book Conquest of Abundance. Feyerabend in that book distinguishes between realism as a hypothesis and realism as a worldview. He discusses the unconscious influence of realism. When we're talking about realism as a hypothesis that can be tested even physically, which is one of the interpretations of quantum theory, he found that the discussions were biased by the fact that there was a second realism that was the worldview, the unconscious or implicit worldview, orientating the discussion of many of the physicists, to the point when the experimental results seem to confer the Bohr-Heisenberg-Pauli approach. The certain physicists said it's a pity, it's a catastrophe. The hypothesis that is reasonable and plausible doesn't work. This is a very sad thing for science. So what Feyerabend does here with Pauli is he takes his standard line of elements and relations, the unities, the essences don't exist, everything is historical, everything is up for grabs. And then he discusses an experience that not many people know about, which is Wolfgang Pauli had over many years, over 26 years, a long correspondence and collaboration with Carl Jung. He underwent an analysis with one of Jung's pupils, and then continued the analysis with Jung himself. His dreams form a very coherent, very interesting, very Deleuzian sequence of dreams, And there, at the beginning of Jung's book, Psychology and Alchemy, he talks about an anonymous, very well cultivated, very intelligent intellectual who had submitted to him a series of dreams. And in fact, these are Pauli's dreams. And Pauli was inspired by the collaboration with Jung to try and search for a language that is both physical and psychological, that bridges the gap between the two, and that overcomes the great bifurcation. He called it a new neutral or psychophysical language, and what will be important would be that it will be composed of, it will be realist in the sense of an underlying idea that it's being that will determine whether our hypotheses are acceptable or not, but that it includes a psychological, religious, imaginative, indirect element, and that it will be composed of concepts that are at the same time symbols. So after that, he was contacted by Israeli military intelligence agent who wanted to discuss the use of pluralism and anarchism in the intelligence work, and there's a very interesting correspondence between them. I'm almost at an end. The last evolution was what I foreshadowed. The Feyerabend decided that even relativism of multiple frameworks is insufficient for political reasons if you don't accord the ontology that goes with the framework of the other traditions. You're putting these other traditions at a lower level, but at the same time, the framework can't be everything. There's the molecular porousness of the frameworks, because empirically, despite the fact that people do have incommensurable points of view, they do manage to discuss, and they do manage to change. Bohr and Einstein were ferocious, in a certain sense, debate. Their points of view were officially, semantically incommensurable, but they were able to communicate, discuss precise details of the interpretations and of experiments. 5 minutes? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's true.
No. Yes. Yes, actually. Yes, actually, yes. That was an intensification. Thank you. A conclusion on the way to immanence. To conclude, I want to talk about a short dialogue between Joachim Jung, another Jung, so I think I'll call him Joachim to avoid ambiguity. And it's called, it's officially The Last Interview. The dialogue took place, in FEYERABEND'S last day, when he was in a hospital with an inoperable brain tumour, with the left side of his body entirely paralysed. He had only, well, he didn't know, but he knew it was coming. He had only 2 weeks to live. The text is quite short, only 10 pages long. Aside from the interlocutors, Feyerabend and Jung, Feyerabend's wife, Grazia Borini, was present, but she didn't intervene except for one point where she makes a clarification. Though she does not take part in the discussion, her presence is of prime importance for situating the dialogue in the context of light and of love that Feyerabend saw as characterizing the final phase of his life. So I forgot to say, the quantum porous framework of relativism turning into democratic, this time not democratic relativism, but democratic pluralism, was the 6th stage. Anyhow, there he is in his bed, paralysed, dying. So this dialogue is truly what Deleuze and Guattari call a moment of grace between life and death, which they talk about in What is Philosophy, where Feyerabend expresses himself with sobriety and sovereign freedom, on the question, what is it that I've been doing all my life? So there's a solemnity of the circumstances. It's a final dialogue. And what does he discuss? He doesn't discuss life after death as Socrates does in the Phaedo. Socrates excluded his wife in the Phaedo to be able to talk about serious things with the boys. He doesn't talk about the necessity to obey the dictates of reason and the laws, as he does in the Critias. It's a thoroughly anti-Platonic dialogue, as FEYERABEND is facing the prospect of what in the last chapter to his book he called fading away, which he meant at the beginning to be the fading away of his profession, and then he realized it was also the fading away of his life. So he discusses the need to abandon the rationalist attitude and to have total freedom from binding rules in research as in life. He envisages his own life as pervaded by freedom, from the assertion that in his teaching he was completely free to the declaration that he had never been hindered in anything. FEYERABEND often claimed that he was not a philosopher and that he had no philosophy. So it's impressive to see that his last public act, when this man who always said, I'm not a philosopher, was, in very dramatic circumstances, to explain, yet again, his disidentification with the category of philosopher and with all categories. So he talks about death and disfigurement as facts of life, but people being in hospitals, being kept barely alive, and of the decision that maybe needed to pull the plug or not. This is something you have to think about, and it's clear, he says, and it's clear that FEYERABEND has thought about it, and then in engaging in a dialogue, he's doing exactly what he wants. Joachim's first question concerns the administrative academic means that FEYERABEND can recommend for promoting new ideas. This is not the sort of question that FEYERABEND typically addresses, and certainly in the situation he doesn't want to reply to. What FEYERABEND wants is to pass from transcendence to immanence. So this is why it's on the path to immanence. The difference with the dialogues we talked about yesterday of Deleuze and Claire Arnay is there Deleuze is with somebody who is, at least in terms of the dialogue, on the same plane of immanence as him. So somebody who's gone very far on the path to immanence. FEYERABEND chooses a different strategy. He could have given an interview or constructed an interview, a dialogue with his wife Grazia. He chooses to have her present for the interview and to talk to Jung, or to Joachim, who has some trouble asking the right questions. Deleuze commented on the sterile quality of many interviews, their imprisonment in these binary oppositions, their blindness to movement and becoming. Deleuze tells us that this is due to the primacy of the reflected attitude, and he contrasts that with openness and fluidity and multiplicity of real life, or what he calls the immanent attitude. So FEYERABEND once again, because most of his things, even against method, is a dialogue, a one-sided dialogue, because the partner, Lakatos, who was meant to reply, died before being able to give a reply. FEYERABEND refuses to give any particular solutions, but he deconstructs the questions and proposes description of his life in symbols. FEYERABEND, just before this interview, he wrote a final, we have the final interview, there's a final letter, which is the introduction to the new edition of Against Method. He says, what I want to do is change your attitude. I want you to sense chaos where at first you noticed an orderly arrangement of well-behaved things and processes. FEYERABEND finds that Jung's questions presuppose too much order, and he responds by trying to get him to sense in his place chaos, ambiguity, multiplicity, fluidity, abundance. Jung is on the way to immanence, and just as anything can be distorted in the direction of transcendence, FEYERABEND says you can twist everything into a rational shape, anything can be bent in a direction. So he wants to bend things not in the direction of transcendence but in the direction of immanence. This is what he tries to do one last time in response to Jung's, to Joachim Jung's awkward questions. Feyerabend, 2 weeks later, died peacefully in his hospital bed, holding hands with Grazia, only 2 weeks after the interview, after more than a week of morphine-induced coma. He tells us at the end of his autobiography, Grazia is with me in the hospital, which is a great joy, and she fills the room with light. The hospital is another cavern, and Feyerabend does not seek the truth outside in some abstraction. He always felt that Grazia was much freer of philosophical abstractions than himself and more humane, and the light he found in her presence was undoubtedly the same sort of non-Platonic light that we considered with Michel Serres at the beginning. That's it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it was very interesting, and I like when you were sort of talking about the truth in the cavern, because it reminded me in the appendix of Logical Sense, which seems to just keep coming up over and over again. There's that bit where Deleuze talks about the cavern being a system of caves, and it was reminiscent of that how you described, the light and darkness in the cavern, and Deleuze is kind of the maze-like cave, with the log crystal.
Yes, I was thinking of Deleuze. Also, Bernard Stiegler, in his latest seminar for over 4 years, has been deconstructing Plato's Republic, and he talks about the necessity of finding the truth inside the cavern, going to a different part of the cavern to get a point of view, another better outlook and a point of view on at least from one part you can get a point of view on another part, and that's according to him the task now. Latour doesn't say it as explicitly, but he wants to get away from the great bifurcation. Dreyfus and Kelly talk about the Homeric perspective. Then they talk about the ontological perspective. They talk about the Dante's Divine Comedy. And then to show they don't use a philosopher as Feyerabend uses Ernst Mach. They use an example dear to Deleuze as well. They use Moby Dick and try to show that there's all the images in Moby Dick go towards reinforcing a pluralist ontology. They have a Heideggerian approach. So in the book, All Things Shining, they consider that to be an ontology of moods. But in the articles around that time, they talk about the difference between a work of art paradigm, which has phases of understandings of being that are incommensurable between each other, and then there's a more Deleuzian paradigm that they find in the later Heidegger, which is called the thing paradigm, or they call it that. And that's where the frameworks are crisscrossed with assemblages that are operated by or operations that constitute things, and then you get the same, with that, you get the same porosity and interchange between frameworks. The rigid, relativistic work of art paradigm makes incomprehensible. So Deleuze and these others all operate, and Michel Serres, of course, the original image.
I would just like to make a distinction a bit more clear to work it out, with the position that I find so valuable in Michel Serres' return to this cave and sun scenario is that for him both the cave and the sun are abstract, So one of his main points is that the obscurity in the cave is the obscurity of the universal, because there are many suns, there are many systems, there are many, but that in Serre crucially does not translate that there are many ontologies. In Serre it crucially translates in an operational perspective on how systems of categoricity, of inclusion, exclusion, distinction and so on can be articulated. So that's where he does not go into a particular interpretation of the symbolic. No, neither in the Jungian sense, since you evoked this psychoanalytical context so strongly in the reading of the dreams, neither in the sense that somehow through this consonant, what I call the consonant line in language, there is some kind of rhizomatic roots where everyone is connected through the same kinds of personalities, but also not in the sense of some kind of original drama and tragedy which determines and predicates everyone equally. So his approach is exactly to operationalize the genetic structures of how such accounts can be articulated. And that means it does not translate back into many ontologies. It's an operational perspective, and I think for also being fair to the Serre position, which is very newly introduced, no, I'm sure it will attract a lot of attention in the next years, to not confuse him there with such interpretations.
I'm going to do something that I hate when people do. I'm going to bring up a remark that Michel Serre made to me in 1980. So
personal conversation.
Yes.
But not a deathbed in this case.
No.
So not so sacred like the other scenarios you bring.
It was in his house, he was full of it. One of the things that I noticed was I met Michel Serre and Jean-François Lyotard, and in the conversations, they both said that I made an allusion to the body, and they said, yes, but what body? We have multiple bodies. I'm not sure what body you're talking about. There's the lived body, there's the biological body, there's the thermodynamic body. Maybe it's not a question of full-blown different ontologies. Maybe Serre was able to go directly to the porous framework approach. My 6 stages of FEYERABEND'S life, intellectual life, can be applied to Michel Serre maybe, to Bruno Latour, who begins with number 3, epistemological anarchism, and ends with process ontology, where FEYERABEND begins. So maybe Michel Serre was able to go there directly, but it seems to me there are lots of discussions in Michel Serre where he does a historical approach, and it seems at least historically he said he was doing what Michel Foucault did in Words and Things, or what is it in English, The Order of Things, and describing the same sort of phenomenon in the evolution of science. So
which is exactly not an ontology. Michel said, Foucault, come on.
I'm flexible. If you don't want to call it an ontology, we could call it a configuration.
Yeah.
That's okay by me.
But then we don't need.
But at the same time, there are cosmological assumptions that change from configuration to configuration. So if you call them cosmologies, this is ontologies, I'm happy. If you say there's not many cosmologies in Michel Serre, I will be unhappy. That depends on you.
No, I need not specify. I just wanted to mark this distinction.
Just because I'm curious. Do you know what was his view on quantum physics? Because you mentioned that he was a kind of bomber, and also he had meeting with von Weizsäcker, which was one of the
Sorry, Ms. Bill?
with von Weizsäcker, one of the proponents of the Copenhagen interpretation.
Yes.
So I'm not aware of this. I'm very interested.
In the 50s and 60s, Feyerabend wrote a real lot on the interpretation of complementarity. He did a lot of book reviews of Reichenbach's books, von Neumann's book, a couple of other books whose authors' names escape me. And he did a very long piece. It was 2 big articles that later were published under one that was called On the Recent Critique of Complementarity 1 and 2, and then it became Niels Bohr's worldview. His idea of I think he had the idea of complementarity before quantum theory, and it was just this idea he presented it first in the Wittgenstein circle with I think there was Heinrich von Wright, there was Anscombe present, and he presented the idea that there can be changes in our cosmology that correspond to changes in the criteria for the applicability of a concept. So he took that idea from complementarity, that when you have a certain arrangement, position becomes defined and velocity becomes undefined. And at that stage, he criticized Bohr intensely for the idea that we needed always to keep classical concepts to describe the experimental arrangement. What they showed us were quantum phenomena, but to describe the setting up of the experiment, Bohr claimed that we would always need classical concepts. So he took a hard line, Feyerabend took a hard line because it was in his pluralist methodology stage that was unacceptable. Much later, once again in the posthumous book, Conquest of Abundance, he comes back to complementarity, and there he sees it as in germ form that will germinate the idea of these multiple realities, each of which excludes the applicability of the other realities. But it's not just 2 complementaries, it's multiple. And there's a second idea to that. So Bohr was kept as well for having the historical approach, but because of that, he decided that Bohr, in fact, didn't presuppose the absolute necessity of keeping stable classical language, and allowed the possibility that it could be replaced one day. Feyerabend himself, at the same time, he was exposed to ideas from Paul Churchland on a computational approach, which derived his major thesis, Feyerabend's major theses, from a consideration of computation and the brain. And Feyerabend said, as far as I'm concerned, this is the second point, this is nothing to do. These 2 descriptions are equivalent. Churchland goes from the inside outside, I go from the outside inside, so I'm talking about the brain. So it's a similar thing. He considered he was talking about complementarity all the time at the end. But that's the notion I lost. His idea was to break it out of the mathematical definition, and he wanted to apply, as Bohr himself did, and he wanted to apply a generic idea of complementarity, which could be applied to the way Bohr tried to apply to mind and body and life and non-life. So Feyerabend thought that what was interesting the approach that gave rise to complementarity was the notion that you could use qualitative arguments as primary over quantitative arguments.
Okay. Should we wrap it up then? Yeah, we finished by 5, is that right?
Yeah.